started our program, she came to us and had experience as a special ed teacher. And when she was thinking about, what am I going to do for my project or thesis, she had lots of different ideas. And I kept wondering how it was going to relate to her past experience as a special education teacher. It was not about bringing special education and art education together in a traditional sense, but it was an experience that she had about having difficult conversations with parents. And that was something that she did as a special education teacher. And it really informed her. And it was something that was very important to her, personal. And also another part of the project was informed by her mom, I believe, with role play. And learning about that and how that can be used as an educational tool. So pulling from past experiences, pulling from family, and then bringing that together in art education was something that Shea did in this project. And it was a pleasure seeing this, and I had the opportunity to see her actually in action teaching, which with a pre-service class as part of her project, which was really lovely. She's an amazing teacher. So Shea, thank you, and the title of her project is Teaching Pre-Service Art Educators How to Discuss What Matters Most, a Field Guide to Difficult Conversations. And I hope that this is something that she shares broadly, because I feel like this is something we can all benefit from. So thank you. Welcome, Shea.
Thank you, Dr. Okay, so let's get started. As Dr. Van mentioned, the title of my project is Teaching Pre-Service Educators How to Discuss What Matters. Dr. Heisey graciously gave me the edit to take out what matters most, because what matters most is arbitrary. But to discuss what matters, a field guide to difficult conversations. And I'm pursuing school certification at UT Austin. Okay, so I first want to take a moment. So I want you to think about a time you may have had a difficult conversation in your life. It doesn't have to be professional, and here are some examples to pull from. Okay, so think about how it made you feel, what that might be like, and keep that in your mind as I go forward in this presentation. So if you do have experience with any of these things, standing up to injustice, any relationship or friendship, even if you haven't called it a difficult conversation, then you have experience with what I'm calling difficult conversations. So if we back up a little bit, what is a difficult conversation? Simply put, it's anything that people find hard to talk about. But more specifically, it's anything that makes a person feel vulnerable, implicates their self-esteem, is important and the outcome is uncertain, or any conversation that matters deeply to either party discussing it. Okay, and so the premise of my project is that difficult conversations are not being taught. And as Dr. Reed mentioned, I saw this firsthand as a therapist for children on the autism spectrum. This is just a silly picture of me and one of the kiddos that I worked with when we had matching bows around Christmas time. But when I was doing that work, difficult discussions came up all the time. Parents would come to me as a therapist and say, you know, will my child talk? Is my child going to be able to go to school like my other kids? And so these parents are approaching me, and we're not trained on how to have these conversations as therapists. Fast forward to now, I'm a pre-service art teacher, and again, there's no training on these topics, and yet these difficult conversations come up in education all the time. Okay. So why do difficult conversations matter in education? So if teachers strive to make the maximum potential impact in schools, they need training to talk about controversial, sensitive, and difficult topics. And we know this because research on new teacher dissatisfaction and attrition suggests that a large percent of teachers leave within their first 5 years of teaching. And if they don't leave, research suggests that they resort to conservative and unimaginative pedagogy in order to survive. And I'm sure all of us have been taught by an unimaginative teacher, and it does not inspire learning. And so, an important data point from 2020 to 2022, the US had a net loss of 600,000 teachers. That's a remarkable number. So in my research, I posit that, back up. So why are teachers leaving? and the research suggests that they leave because of a few reasons. A lack of preparedness, school cultures of accountability and compliance, and then conflicts between school expectations and individual teacher beliefs. So in my research, I posit that all of these reasons share a commonality. If an educator is to confront any of these reasons and attempt to stay in the school systems, then they're going to have difficult conversations. So if we want to retain our teachers, especially our good teachers, we need to prepare them more holistically for contemporary classrooms and give them the tools to discuss what matters. Okay, here's my research question. So what research-based strategies can be used to teach pre-service students at UT how to prepare for difficult conversations in their future careers as art educators? Okay, so my literature review contains several broad topics, including civic education as a necessary component of art education, looking at pre-service preparation as a whole, particularly in Texas, and curricular theory. But in this presentation, because of lack of time, I'm going to focus on difficult conversations and forum theater. So starting with difficult conversations, my study is based on the idea that every difficult conversation shares a common structure. And this was put forth by Stone and colleagues at Harvard. And so by understanding the structure and becoming familiar with this conversation structure, the idea is that we can become better equipped to approach difficult conversations. So essentially, what does that mean? These are teachable skills. So not only is there a common structure in these conversations, but people make predictable errors and they fall into similar behavior patterns and thinking traps that often turn a conversation into a difficult conversation. So much of this project involved teaching pre-service educators about this conversation structure and these behavior patterns and thinking traps and how to avoid them. Okay, so the second part of my lit review that I'm going to go over is forum theater, which I relied pretty extensively on in my workshop, which I'll talk about later. So first, I want to talk about Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian educator, and he wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he basically suggested that education has the potential to transform students and society if educators change their styles to be more active and engaged. We're all educators, so that's probably not surprising to us. And then Augusto Boal was inspired by Freire's ideas, and he's also a Brazilian educator. And he wrote Theater of the Oppressed, and he saw how theater could teach a citizen to break existing systems of oppression. Okay, so what is forum theater? Essentially, forum theater is a simulated situation in a controlled environment where participants are given the opportunity to practice problem solving through theater to prepare for real life action. And that's what Boal put forward in his Theater of the Oppressed. Okay, so moving on to the theoretical framework I used for this project. Really short and sweet title, Social Reconstructionist Curricular Theory. And this is a theoretical framework that is conscious of the problems and injustices present in society. And furthermore, assumes that the purpose of education and curriculum is to construct a new and more just society for all members. And this was important in my work because I believe that pre-service teachers having the tools for difficult conversations will equip them with the skills they need to build these new and more equitable school communities. Okay. My methodology, I used an action research methodology, which essentially is a predefined series of steps that are repeated over time in the cycle. It's also known as a cycle of inquiry. The cycle starts by proposing a change to a problem based on data. Then a plan is put into place to address the problem, the plan is implemented, and the cycle is repeated. So action research is highly tailored to each unique research context, and therefore is not really generalizable beyond the context in which the results were discovered, but it's a really powerful tool in educational contexts and school systems and school environments. Okay, so ignore the arrows, they're supposed to be in a circle. So how does action research apply to my project? So the first thing I did was identify the problem, which was a lack of training in pre-service educators in difficult conversations. Then I collected data on the problem and designed it and implemented a course. I evaluated that data, and then I wrote my capstone and am presenting here, and the idea is that this cycle would repeat. Okay, so now to my project. I tried to simplify it in these columns that I'll explain. Essentially, there were 3 written components that had to discuss what matters most: workbook, PowerPoint slides, and facilitator's guide with corresponding role-play scenarios. All 3 of these written components, though, were created ultimately to accompany the in-person workshop. And this was a 5-week in-person workshop that I designed and implemented using Forum Leader. And then to guide that workshop, I administered 2 surveys: a pre-survey to create the workshop to understand what are these students' needs, what are their baselines, and then designed and created the workshop. And then after implementing the workshop, I administered the post-training evaluation to gather data on the relative effectiveness of the workshop. So essentially, all 3 parts of this project intertwine and intersect, but ultimately serve to guide the workshop. Okay, so the workshop. I taught this workshop to 15 art education seniors at UT Austin in the Criticisms and Conversations in Art course taught by Dr. Lisa Costello. Huge shout out to her. And these students in this course are actually now student teaching, so they were the most relevant group to pilot this project. I taught this workshop over the course of 5 Thursdays in October to November, and got a talent release agreement to do that. Okay, data collection. So as I previously mentioned, I had 2 surveys, and those surveys had 2 types of questions: Likert style questions, which collected quantitative data, and open-ended questions, which I used to collect qualitative data. I also pulled qualitative data from the open-ended written sections of the workbook that students filled out throughout the course. And to analyze the qualitative data, I performed content analysis, which essentially is a type of qualitative analysis where words are analyzed for common themes, phrases, and concepts to better understand the wide variety of data. Okay, so the preliminary survey, this was the survey that was administered to participants prior to the first week of the workshop. And this really drove emergent curriculum, which is essentially a way of creating curriculum that centers around the interests and needs of the students that you're teaching. So I administered this survey, and then from there, that guided the creation of the workbook, role-play scenarios, and the workshop. So by understanding the students' needs, and in the example section, there are a few of the things that students felt concerned about. They felt concerned about offending parents. They wanted to learn about setting boundaries. I worked all of those eventually into the curriculum that I created. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly go into the 5 weeks of the workshop. Prior to each week of the workshop, participants were asked to read a module of the workbook I created. This workbook contained written sections and interactive writing sections throughout. This is a page from one of the workbook sections. And then in class, I utilized a short lecture format to discuss and teach the workbook topics more deeply. Okay, so week 1, we just talked about difficult conversations, what they are. Week 2, talked about that broad structure that I discussed and introduced some student actors. Week 3 and 4, we went into forum theater, talked about conversation strategies, and I introduced relevant artists, which I felt was important in an art education classroom. And then in the final week, we did art making and reflection, and this is a picture from a week 5 reflection activity in the workshop. Okay, and I'm not going to go into depth about my facilitator's guide, but I wanted to discuss it briefly. So essentially, the facilitator's guide was a document that I made that was designed so that an independent facilitator could take this course, read the facilitator's guide, and understand how to implement it for a group of pre-service educators. Essentially, it contains the agenda for the workshop, a breakdown of each module, description of the engagement activities that I did, how to do them, written out role-play scenarios, and any recommended readings or further research for their own learning. Okay, so in 3 of the 5 live sessions, participants were invited to participate in forum theater to practice difficult conversations in real time. In week 1, as part of emergent curriculum, as I mentioned, I asked participants for examples that they had encountered in their own lives of difficult conversations. And I used many of those examples in the role-play scenarios in Forum Theater. So part 1 of Forum Theater is a bit lower stakes. And essentially what that looked like was student actors were asked to perform a scene to the climax of a problem. Then the participants in the classroom were asked for solutions to the posed problem. And throughout that time, I acted as a kind of facilitator, taking student suggestions, going to the actors, figuring out what that was going to look like, and then the actors would react the student suggestions out, and they would perform those scenes until an agreed upon solution was reached. So basically the participants are making suggestions and watching the actors perform difficult conversations in real time. This next clip is a short sample of what this looked like with me facilitating and actors acting out the scene. I will say it's my first dip into closed captioning, so yeah. Oh no.
Help decorate posters and assistance in various second grade tasks. Stacy feels really fed up and taken advantage of, but has yet to communicate this feelings. Matthew, welcome to our teacher. We are very excited student project. It's very really easy. I just need to help us best out really quick. No. I'm sorry, but I'm tired of asking for my help because I'm really busy too. I just want to see that. And this is easy too.
The camera had to stay in place and I didn't have someone to use it, so it's not the best video, but I just wanted to show
And then,
what that
Missy has repeated me
Okay. So moving on to Forum Theater Part 2. This was the next week. This time, instead of the actors performing the scene up to the climax, the actors are performing an entire scene gone wrong. And this time, the participants in the class can come in and act out their desired solution and resolution to the problem. So the difference between Part 1 and Part 2, participants are actually getting up there themselves and seeing and feeling what having a difficult conversation looks like while they're so you're watching that one student, watching that one student kind of struggle through having that awkward conversation, and but it was kind of cool because he had the opportunity in a safe space to pause and be like, oh gosh, I don't know what to say, and then the participants would come in and give suggestions, and it was a really unique opportunity, and it was really great to see the engagement in the class. So talking about Forum Theater, it was basically students are actively practicing learned communication strategies through body language, speaking movement, and critical thinking. And they're feeling their heartbeat race in real time, feeling what it really feels like to have a difficult conversation and getting to practice that. This is a quote from one of the surveys one of the students was in class. I'm going to briefly gloss over this. This is the last part of my project. The final week, we did an art making section, and I asked each student to bring in 2 images, each representing a different point of view on a topic. This was based off the work of Din Lei. And essentially, they created some works where we did paper weaving, and they weaved together 2 different perspectives. I thought it was really important to have some sort of art making component. And for the results, so I compared the pre-survey to the post-survey data. I looked at quantitative data, the 5-point Likert scale, questions like how prepared, competent, and confident do you feel to address difficult conversations in your professional career? Students grew in their preparedness, competence, and confidence from the beginning to the end of the workshop. This is a graph of how prepared do you feel, and so you can see that there's progress. And at the end of the workshop, a third of the students left feeling extremely prepared, competent, and confident after attending the workshop, which was really great to see. And then in the qualitative analysis, I identified 2 important themes. The first was the interactive nature of the workshop and the workbook that was really effective and helped really guide learning. This is a quote from one of the students in the class. I felt like that was the best research-based strategy that I used in my teaching, and I could feel really the engagement as like those active learning strategies as we were using them. And the second was form leader. Students were super timid at first, but having that part one where they got to offer suggestions, actors would act them out, and then kind of scaffolding instructions so that we're kind of, they were then interviewing the scenes really helped. And once they saw their peers kind of jump up and start to engage, almost everyone practiced and felt that, this is another quote from a student, felt that it was super helpful to their learning. Overall, it appears that the workshop was well received by students and perceived as helpful in their overall education. All of them said that they would recommend this training to a friend or colleague, which was nice to see. Future avenues for research. Basically, my hope is that students who participate in the workshop feel empowered to begin careers as art teachers and engage with difficult conversations that they may encounter. I hope to package the components of this workshop, the workbook, all the written components, and disseminate it so that other pre-service educators may experience the positive impacts of the workshop. And then finally, my own personal reflections. This project really helped me realize how to bridge my past work as a behavior analyst and my current work as an art educator. It helped me realize that both fields are more congruous and align in more ways than I thought. I ended up using a lot of the same psychological principles and techniques that I learned in my past work and applying them to teaching. And this project really helped me realize that. I also realized that my way of thinking and learning and teaching really aligns nicely with action research. I enjoy that action research is a continuous and iterative process. And then finally, that difficult conversation is a topic that's meaningful for most pre-service students, which I don't think I would have thought going into this, and not just me. Is that charismatic?